So you want to learn how to play chess? Well, you've come to the right place, because today we're going to teach you everything you need to know to be able to play the oldest and most beautiful game in the world. By the end of the video, you'll know how all the pieces move, how to set up the board, how to win a game, and also all the special rules like castling and pawn promotion. Chess is played on a 64 square grid, and every game starts like this. There are two sides, white and black, and each side has 16 chess pieces, or chessmen, made up of 8 pawns along the second row, 2 rooks, 2 knights, 2 bishops, one on the dark squares, one on the light squares, a queen, and most importantly, a king. Pretty easy so far, right? Well, let's learn how the pieces move now. Let's start with the rook. Now, the rook is like a cannon. It can go up, down, left, and right. As long as there's no piece getting in the way, the rook can travel as many squares at once as it wants to. Now, similar to the rook is the bishop, but the bishop doesn't travel up and down, it travels diagonally. And that's why we have 2 bishops. We have one on the dark squares and one on the light squares. So the dark squared bishop can only go on the dark squares, and the light squared bishop can only go on the light squares. And likewise, as long as there's no piece blocking the way, the bishops can travel the whole length of the board at once. And that brings us to the most powerful piece on the chessboard, the queen. Because the queen is a combination of both the rook and the bishop. It can travel up, down, left, right, and diagonally. And again, as long as there's no piece to block the path, she can move as far as she wants to in one go, which makes the queen just a very, very powerful piece. What about the king then? Well, the king is actually the weakest piece on the chessboard, because if you lose the king, you lose the game. And the king can only move 1 square at a time, but in any direction. So the king can move to any of these 8 squares. We've got 2 more pieces to cover, the knight and the pawn. So let's take a look at the knight. The knight moves a little bit differently to the other pieces. The knight moves in an L shape. So you can think about it by going 2 squares one way, and then 1 square either to the left or to the right. So the knight moves in an L shape. And if you think about how many different moves the knight has, there are 8 in total. When the knight is on the center of the board, these are all the squares that the knight can land on with that L-shaped move. If the knight is on the edge of the board, there's fewer squares, as we can see here. And if the knight is in the corner, there are only 2 squares that the knight can move to. So you don't want to keep your knights on the edge, you want to keep them in the center. Now, last but definitely not least are your pawns. Your pawns are your foot soldiers, and you have 8 of them across the second rank when you start the game. Pawns move 1 square at a time up the board, except for when they are blocked. So if there's another piece in front of them, they can't move forward. Now, a couple of interesting things about pawns. When you haven't moved a pawn yet, you have the option to move it 2 squares at once instead of 1. You can move it 1 square if you want, but you have the option to move it 2 squares at once only when you haven't moved the pawn before. And the other interesting thing about pawns is they move forward 1 square at a time, except for when they capture an opponent's piece. And when they capture an opponent's piece, they actually move diagonally. So let's say our opponent had a pawn here, and they moved it up 2 squares. We could either move our pawn forward, or we could capture their pawn. And there we go. Now you know how all the pieces move. So let's go on to how to set up the board. We'll start with an empty board like this, and we just need to make sure that the bottom right-hand corner is a light square. And that goes for your opponent as well. It'll just be reversed because they're sitting on the other side of the board. So the first pieces we're going to add are our pawns, just like that. And then we're going to add our 2 rooks in the corners. After the rooks, we're going to add the knights right next to them. and then the 2 bishops on either side of the knights, and then last but not least, the king and the queen. And the important thing to remember is the white queen goes on the white square, and when we get to the black queen, black will put their queen on the black square, and then the king fills in the gap here. And voila, we have a board set up and ready to play right in front of us. Now when it comes to playing, white always starts first, and then after white's played their move, black follows. And each side alternates one move at a time until someone wins the game. So now let's cover how to win a game of chess. Now to win a game of chess, you need to capture your opponent's king. In the ancient times, they called this shachmat, which means the king is dead. Nowadays, we call it checkmate. And so to understand checkmate, first we need to understand check. Check is when we simply attack the king, attack the enemy king. So here we have moved our queen and we're attacking the king, and this is a check. This means our opponent needs to figure out what to do with the king, because on the next move, we're going to capture the king. And now, although in chess you don't actually capture the king, because your opponent must move the king out of the way or block the check somehow by putting a piece in between or capturing your queen, our opponent is going to slide across here and get out of the check. And here we could continue checking with our queen. Check, 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 check. So that's check when we attack the king. But as we can see, the king has many squares to escape to. Checkmate is when the king has no squares to escape to. So let's say, for example, the king goes here and we start trapping the king on the edge of the board. And suddenly our rook is cutting off the enemy king, and he can only move here, and our queen jumps in and delivers what's called checkmate. Here we're putting the king into check, we're attacking the king, and the king has no legal squares it can go to, because the rook is cutting the king off this way and the queen is controlling the whole edge of the board. This is checkmate, and here white has won the game. Just to go back quickly, when white put the black king in check, black cannot even mistakenly play another move like pushing the pawn forward, because that's an illegal move. Your opponent will say, you cannot move that, you must move your king. So just to recap, the person who first checkmates the opponent's king wins the game. Now, believe it or not, but you're almost ready to go away and start playing your first game of chess. There's just a few quick special rules we need to cover before you go. The first of these is what happens when a pawn reaches the other side of the board. As you can see here, once the pawn reaches the other side, your pawn promotes, and you get to choose whether to promote the pawn to a queen, a rook, a knight, or a bishop. And now, because the queen is just such a powerful piece, by far the most powerful piece on the chessboard, 99% of the time you're going to promote to a queen. And if you think about why that's useful, it's because you can't checkmate a king with just another king and a pawn. You need to promote that pawn to a queen, and once that pawn promotes to a queen, as we saw previously, we can move the king to the edge of the board and deliver checkmate and thereby win the game. Now the second special move we're going to look at also involves pawns, and it's called en passant, which is French for in passing, and you'll see in a moment why it's called that. Now let's say we start the game like this and decide to move our pawn forward. And now our opponent wants to move one of these two pawns, let's say this one here, and like we said, we can either move the pawn forward 1 square or 2 squares. The thing is, if our opponent moves the pawn forward 1 square, we can capture it, which is fine, our opponent can capture back. But what if our opponent moves it forward 2 squares? Well, the en passant rule, or in passing, means we have the option only on this very next move to still capture the pawn as if it had only moved 1 square forward. And now if we don't do that, if instead we play something like this and our opponent continues, we no longer have that option. That is no longer a move, and the pawn structure is now solid. We can only move forward. So that's en passant. The last of the special moves we're going to look at is called castling, and it involves the king and the rooks. And it goes like this. Instead of moving our king one square across, we're going to move our king 2 squares across. And when we do that, our rook is going to go from the corner over our king. So essentially, this helps us get our king to safety in the corner and helps us get our rook out of the corner and into the action all in one move, which makes castling a really strong move to play. Now, when we castle to this side, it's called kingside castling or short castling. And when we castle to this side, it's called queenside castling or long castling. And it goes like this. Same way, we move our king 2 squares across, and then the rook comes over from the corner onto the other side. Now, this is where things can get a little bit tricky, because you lose the right to castle if these 2 things happen. One of those 2 things is when your opponent controls one of the squares that your king needs to pass or land on in order to castle. So in this case, white's queen controls that c8 square, and so the king cannot safely castle to the queen side. And the other time you lose the right to castle is when you've already moved your king, or you've moved the rook on the side that you're looking to castle. So for instance, black can no longer castle to the king side because he's already moved that rook. But once this queen moves out of the way, say here, now black can castle queenside because the queen is no longer controlling that square. And that's castling for you, and that's all the special rules in chess. Now, the very last thing we need to cover is how chess games can end as draws. Now, there are several ways the games can end in draws. One of these is the players can simply agree to have a draw. So it could be a very equal position and you don't want to continue, and you might want to offer your opponent a draw. Hey, would you like a draw? Your opponent says yes, and there. That's a draw by agreement. Another type of draw is when there's just insufficient material on the board or not enough pieces on the board to result in a checkmate. So this is a classic example where it's just king versus king, and these kings can just dance around the board for as long as they want. No checkmate can happen, and therefore this is a draw. Now this leads us to the sneakiest draw in chess, which is stalemate. And stalemate is when you leave your opponent with no legal moves. A classic example is here. White is a queen up and can deliver checkmate simply like this. However, if white mistakenly moves the queen here, now this is a draw because the black king has no legal moves. He can't go here, he can't go here, and he can't go here. So when you leave your opponent with no legal moves, it's stalemate, which is a draw. So watch out for that, especially if you're winning. A draw can also happen in chess when you repeat the same position 3 times with the same player to move each time. And this is called draw by threefold repetition. And it goes like this. This is an example. Queen check, check, and now we're repeating the position a second time. And we've repeated the position 3 times, and this results in a draw. And just a quick note on this, we can throw in a couple of other moves. So for instance, we can go check here, check here, check here, and then come back to that same position. So it doesn't have to be 3 times in a row, it just has to be the same position 3 times. And very similar to threefold repetition is something called perpetual check. Perpetual check is simply when you can check your opponent forever and they cannot do anything about it. So in this case, black has 3 queens and a rook, whereas white only has a queen. So black should win this game. However, white can go check. The black king has to move across. Check, check, and we can continue to do this forever. Black's king is stuck. We're going to hit threefold repetition, but essentially it's perpetual check. And one final way a chess game can be drawn is if no pawn is moved or no piece is taken for 50 moves by each side. That's the 50 move rule in chess. This one's a bit rarer because it means the game has dragged on for a long time and no one has been able to win or make any progress, but it does happen from time to time. And that's it. That's how to play chess in just 15 minutes. So now go grab a chessboard, find a friend, grab a family member, and get to playing. Hope you guys enjoyed the video. Like and subscribe and all that good stuff. And consider checking out my channel for more chess content. See you later.